everybody, and welcome to our first session of the 2019 IEEE Women in Engineering Leadership Conference. And this is our virtual track. My name is Kathy Hearing Hayashi, and I am the General Chair for the conference and your moderator today for what should be a very interesting and educational session on change management and dealing with conflict. I have a little bit of echo here, so let me see if I can get that. Is anyone else hearing the echo? All right. Today we're going to talk about resiliency and female leadership qualities and approaches with two very amazing speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. We're also making today's event an interactive one, and we want to hear from you. So if you have a question for the panel, please use the chat feature on the right-hand side of the screen, and I see some of you already have that. And or you can ask a question at the bottom of the screen. So look for that icon at the bottom that says ask a question. We will monitor those throughout the session and get to as many of the questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So let us introduce our speakers today. We have two amazing speakers. And the first I'd like to introduce is Patty Vargas. She is a recognized leader in performance and change management with a proven track record in behavioral, organizational, and personal change. Patty, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you guys and be able to discuss probably my favorite topic in the world, which is all about change and managing through change. So as Kathy said, I'm a speaker and a best-selling author and a corporate trainer. And primarily, I focus on the areas of managing through change, whether that's personal or corporate, any kind of change that people are working through. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Well, thank you, Patty. I'd also like to introduce Charmaine Hammond. She has helped leaders, HR professionals, and teams resolve conflicts in the workplace and develop leadership skills and building teams to work better together. Charmaine, could you introduce yourself a little bit?
You bet. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Really excited about this conversation that we're going to be having today. And my background actually started out in the prison system. I was a correctional officer. You can imagine the amount of conflict and change that we dealt with. And when I left that system after 10 years of being a correctional officer, I went back to school and got trained and got a master's to become a dispute resolution expert. And so I was a mediator. And through the process of mediating hundreds of cases with thousands of people, I found that a lot of people were struggling with resilience after a change and after a conflict. And so I love, Patty's perspective, which you're going to hear about today around resilience and change management. And this conversation today will cover really change management, conflict resolution, and resilience, all wrapped up into one package.
All right. Well, thank you both. I'm so glad to have you on the panel today. So we have a couple topics, as you mentioned, that we're going to be talking about. So the first is dealing with conflict and change management. So poorly managed change leads to a great conflict among teams. So can we talk about what some of the leaders should be prepared for and what they should look out for?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, one of the interesting stats I just read the other day when I was preparing for a presentation is 42% of the leaders actually don't have conflict management training, yet more than 50% of their time is spent on dealing with conflict. And one of the things that happens with conflict, not only does it erode our resilience, our ability to cope with things as it comes up, conflict, when it's not well managed, can very much damage trust. It can damage relationships. And for many people, it stops them from having other courageous dialogues in the future. Because if they have a negative outcome or things go sideways and they can't get things back on track, often what happens is we hear in the workplace things like, well, I'm not addressing that because it went sideways last time. Mm-hmm. And so it builds up this kind of complacent behavior and culture in the workplace. Yet when conflict is well managed, wow, the outcomes, and I'm sure you've seen this so many times, Patty, in your work, the outcomes are innovation and synergy and everyday problems solved by solutions that people can live up to and support. And most importantly, people's trust is restored and the ability to work better together gets back on track.
Yeah, I completely agree. We don't deal with conflict well. I mean, for the most part, people are conflict averse. It just kind of tends to be in our nature. And so thinking that we don't need to prepare leaders for conflict is just ridiculous, because it is, every time you have more than one person working on anything, there's going to be some level of conflict. So they need to have experience, and not just experience, but they need to be comfortable with it. And the best way to get comfortable is to have a conflict management plan. How are we going to deal with this? And one thing I like to encourage teams to do when they're coming together is develop that themselves. And then if the leader is helping to guide through, here's how we will handle disagreements that are behavioral. Here's how we're going to handle differences in a technology approach, that kind of thing. You're creating a safe space for people to disagree with one another and not be afraid of the conflict that's going to come about. Because conflict comes up, we get all freaked out about it. We try to sweep it under the rug and, oh, well, let's just deal with that later, or let's take that offline, or any number of comments that people use to try to shut it down. But what happens is it just comes back around again, because the problem hasn't been resolved. You're not solving anything. I like to tell people that bad news does not get better with time. So deal with it now. And the people that learn how to be comfortable with conflict and work together through that, it does breed creativity and trust. You can't really have trust among a team until they've addressed their conflict issues.
Yeah. And I love what you said a minute ago, Patty, around the perception, because most people that I meet in my work view conflict as negative, bad, awful, something that should be avoided. And at its simplest form, conflict is just disagreement. It's a difference in perception, needs, values, wants, beliefs. It's just disagreement. And it's what people do with it when they're in conflict. So it's all those unchecked assumptions that we make about people, or it's those miscommunications that we don't go and clarify that turn into big conflicts, or there's those fears that we hold ourselves, such as, I don't want to hurt someone's feelings, or what if I make it worse? And my experience has told me that if that's the question that goes through our head, it's even more important for us to deal with that conversation. And, people, for the most part, even if you're uncomfortable in one of these conversations, if you're just transparent, if a leader's transparent and says, I've got some really important things to talk to you about today, and this might be uncomfortable, but our relationship is so important to me that we're going to get through this together. So when you can be transparent and provide statements of hope, and even if that means letting people know this might feel awkward, but we're going to work through it, people will engage and they feel supported by your vulnerability.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And another thing is, if there is an absence of conflict on your teams, that's a bad sign.
Yes.
Because it indicates that they have checked out, they're apathetic, they don't care. Passion breeds energy and disagreement and conflicting ideas and approaches and things. So when everybody's just super quiet and you think, man, I've done a great job of making this happy little team. No, they're probably dead. And you have a problem. That's a bigger problem to resolve.
And then actually that's just one of the signals that something needs to happen within your organization. And so that's some good things that you talked about, having a plan for training. And then also one of the things is training your team and training your managers on how to recognize some of those signals, to recognize that maybe it is too quiet. Now, are they really saying that? So what are some of the trainings that you can give, or recommendations, like holding meetings, or how to respond when someone is that storming and forming part? How do you respond to that? So what are some training that you can give some of the middle managers or other people on your team?
In working with folks that are going through organizational change, let's say they're they're putting in a new system, or they're reorganizing, or they've just gone through a painful downsizing or restructure, that type of thing. I really stress to the leaders that you need to get very close with your middle managers. They're the ones who are the closest to the people that are being the most impacted by whatever it is that's going on. And you need to teach them, like you said, Kathy, what are the signals? What are the signs that you might see that your team is in trouble? And that can be as simple as some town halls, maybe being led by people who are conflict resolution specialists or change management specialists who can say, here's what you need to look for. People often don't even think about that. What we see is that before some sort of change is implemented, the leaders have all been talking about it and dealing with it and thinking about it for months before it gets rolled out to the rank and file. And then they have a hard time understanding why everybody's just not on board with them. Well, they're not on board because it's brand new to them. And if we don't work with those middle managers that are the closest to the folks, then they may be reeling from their own feelings about this change and so forth. So how do we give them some emotional support, give them the tools that they need to know what to look for, so that they can really be a leader in that space and truly change the game and change the outcome of how this is going to go?
Yeah. I love what you've said there, Patty. It's so valuable. And it just reminds me of the importance of helping middle managers make that transition, because any of you listening who have ever done that transition of going from leading or being on the team, so being a team member, and then leading that very same group of people. So going from being on the team to leading that team is one of the most difficult challenges and transitions we make in leadership. And there's a real opportunity there to help train employees and the team and the middle managers with conflict resolution skills. So that might include things like learning how to ask great open-ended questions. Who,
Yes.
where, when, why, and how. How to really look for some of the behaviors that contribute to conflict. So because in conflict, the research tells us only about 10% of what is going on is actually the substance of the disagreement. The 90% that's going on is the drama, the emotion, the nonverbals, the unchecked. So when we can just train people on communication skills, how to check out an assumption, how to provide meaningful, constructive feedback and positive feedback. And then process, I have a 5-step process that I use in my work that's an interest-based model of conflict resolution. And it's just 5 steps that work around conflict management. And if people have this guide or a roadmap, my experience is that they'll give it a try. They feel supported by the skills because most times we hire people for their technical abilities, their ability to do the job. And it doesn't mean that we all come with great communication and conflict resolution skills. So they are really vital, vital skills.
Yeah. And I love the idea of having a model to follow, because it does give people a sense of comfort of what is the next thing that I should do. And we don't really know how to communicate with one another. We don't know how to ask the right kinds of questions. And, I like to tell folks, if you're not getting the answers, you're asking the wrong questions. And so you have to go back to the beginning and start again with those open-ended questions and digging in types questions, the 5 whys and so forth. But I also think it's so important that you just create a safe space where it's okay for them up to a certain point to express, I don't like this, I'm confused, because the bottom line is what's going to happen to me. What's going to happen to me in this change? And until we can give them that space to be able to talk about that, they can't begin to see the bigger picture about why this might be good for the organization or why this was necessary in this given circumstance. So making them feel safe with asking those questions or expressing those hurts and emotions.
Yeah, I love that.
And I like that what you were saying is that you have a model, you've got a plan, because one of the questions is, how long does it take for change, to have the change and to make sure that, if you're following a model, you can actually see where you are. And so one of the questions, how long does it take to have sufficient change for an organization?
Wow.
And, when you're doing conference.
Yeah.
So change is a multi-step process, going through the change to transition to transformation. And it's a lot of times it's likened to the 5 stages of grief, where you're becoming accustomed to it, you're going through the denial, all of those different stages. And the problem with those kinds of things is that they are not linear. You don't go from this stage to this stage to this stage to this stage. At any point, you can fall back into one of the previous stages as that onion is unpeeled a little bit more and you begin to discover something you didn't know about it. At the same time, the people in an organization or the people that you might be leading are not at the same place on that change, that transition model either. You've got your early adopters, you've got your lagger behinds, you've got all of that, and you as the leader, you're trying to manage through all of that and see what do people exhibit at these various stages. So how long will it take? It will take as long as it takes, but it also will take as long as you manage through it too. So poorly managed change or not managed at all change is going to take forever. And that's why we see initiatives that fail and they become the flavor of the month. And, we tried that before. It's because it wasn't managed through those various stages.
Yeah, I love the work of William Bridges, and I read his book many years ago, Managing Transitions. But what I most enjoy about his work is he talks about the middle zone, and he talks about
fallow ground.
Yeah, change begins with an ending, and this is really an important concept here. That for something to change, there's an ending that's happening. So a project might be completing for a new endeavor to take place. A staff person may be leaving their position or going to another department. So there's also in change process a lot of grief work that happens for people. And the tough part is in that middle zone when the old way is not out and the new way is not in, and heck, we might not even know how to make the new way work yet. There might be policies that come into place and new relationships being built. So it's sort of like Linus with from the cartoons with his dryer and the blanket, or his blanket and the dryer. That security blanket. It's close by, but it's not right there, and we feel like we're walking on a tightrope. So one of the pieces that I think is really important about helping change be managed in a effective way is to think about the transitions and communicating by what I call a cascading series of messages. A lot of what gets in the way of change is the fact when people don't know answers, they make up the end of the story. So in change, there are so many rumors going around and gossip going around. So if as leaders, we can communicate in a variety of formats. For example, you might share something at a staff meeting, but inevitably somebody's missing and didn't get the message. And if they don't hear it quickly, they feel left out. And so what we can do is make sure that we follow up with staff meeting notes, or we do a quick email to summarize those important points. If we have no information or new updates, even letting people know there's no updates from last week, nothing new to share, because then people know, okay, no news is sort of good news. But when they don't hear that, they think, why aren't they telling us anything? And fear sets in. So communication is such an important part of that change process. And then recognizing, that there's different working styles in every team. We have those, as Hal Stack says, we have those drivers. We have those amiable folks that are the relationship workers. We have the expressive working style that's big picture thinkers, and then we have the analytical working style that's really process driven. And when we can understand how our employees on our team work, we can help them cope better with change and some of the emotional aspects of managing change in the workplace.
And those two things put together, recognizing people's different styles and the communication piece is really important because people don't take in information the same way. And in the absence of information, we just make stuff up. And that's not what you want happening, during a time of change, because it's fraught with danger, right? So if you've got to do it from a written standpoint, you've got to do it from a verbal standpoint, you've got to do it from the big group standpoint, rinse, repeat over and over and over again, because there is no such thing as communicating too much during a time of change. And when you start withholding, because I like what you said about there is no news, that's a good thing, because when you start withholding, or that's how it appears to people that you're withholding, then they're like, oh, this isn't over. There's another shoe to drop. I knew it. And now you are back in that whole cycle.
Yeah. One of my clients they had a massive change management process going on that was affecting numerous departments and numerous projects. So people were midway into big projects, and then all of a sudden a policy change and new technology changes everything for everyone. And the leader, I thought, despite all the stress that he was facing, because he said to me, I just feel really out of my element. But one of the things that he did that was so powerful is he tracked every single question that people raised. And he created an FAQ, a frequently asked question document, which helped them so much in their next change process, because they were able to anticipate in advance the questions, the fears, the worries have. And the reason I got called into that company was because they were not prepared for all of the conflict that would happen. Change brings about old issues. Yes. So if ever you're going through a change process, be prepared that old conflicts that you thought were buried and resolved may come up, and new ones will come up, because people are dancing in this element of fear and unknown. So if you can prepare, knowing that you're going to go into some what I call courageous dialogues, these difficult conversations, you can start to anticipate that early on and prepare your team and be effective in resolving things really quickly, so it doesn't impact that change process. And the time limits maybe become a little shorter because it's being better managed.
Yeah, and I think that's a great discussion, especially you also brought on some of the personality styles. Don't forget the rebels, the reactors, and the dreamers. And so some of those, because that's me. And so talking then a little bit about how women lead differently than men. So can you talk a little bit about, sometimes we lead more collaboratively. What are some other things and the differences, and how to just be effective with the personalities that we have?
That's a rich question. And I've had the chance to work with lots of leaders and men over my lifespan. And one of the things that I've noticed with women leaders is that there's often and this is sort of generalizing. So, but with women, there's often sort of a nurturing role or a high degree of empathy that comes in. So I've noticed that often women in leadership roles will place high value on relationship, on resilience. And there's often for women a desire to be collaborative in nature instead of competitive. So I hear a lot from women leaders that they find the process of bringing people together, creating culture, creating a team that works better together, that a lot of them say it feels natural for me. It's sort of like how I do things. And when I've talked to a lot of male leaders that I've worked with over the years, a lot of them say, sometimes it's just faster for me to do it on my own, and I've got to take a step back and remember how important engagement is. And, there's a lot of generalizations here, but the other piece that I think is important to note is that one of the struggles that I hear from a lot of women who are in a leadership capacity is that sometimes they would like to be more directive or more results focused or sort of not always having to be collaborative. So I hear from them that sometimes it's sort of this dance that they're doing, trying to play in both worlds.
Yeah, I like what you said just there at the very end, because there are times that you have done the collaborating, you've done the listening, you've done the pulling in and getting people's perspectives and making sure nobody's disenfranchised or left on the sidelines and so forth. And then all right, now we have to make a decision, and we're going to go this way. So I think that women instinctively understand that is more effective after you have taken a little bit of time, as much time as is available to you in the given circumstance, but taken a little bit of time to pull others into that. And then when you pull the trigger, it's better received. Because we spend so much time worrying about, am I going to be perceived as this or as that, and one of these days we'll be past that. And it'll just be, this is the way, that we lead. But we talk about the behavioral styles, and I am, if you look at a DISC model, I am a C and an S. So I am analytical, I am data driven, I am, give me all the facts type of person. And then I'm this team builder, collaborative, kumbaya person. So it's kind of an interesting mix, maybe a little bit, a push and pull, because I will get sick of myself, and say, okay, this is the direction that we're going to go. This is finally where the data is leading us, and it's what we're going to do. And feeling comfortable in doing that is great strides for a woman leader in knowing that I don't need to be directive. I need to be confident. I need to move when I got the information and when I know what we should do, and people will come along with you because of the other work that you've done with them. The relationship is, and I hate to generalize, just like you said, but we do fall into generalizations. It seems like a lot of times with the men that I coach, with a majority of the men that I coach, it's relationship is second, whereas with women, relationship is first. And relationship kind of tends to soften the edges, soften the blows, give people more confidence to follow you, because they feel like they're not being pushed, they're being walked alongside with, I guess.
Interesting. So valuable. It's interesting. When I was a mediator years ago, and so I would mediate in corporate type conflicts, one of the things that was interesting for me to observe over 10 years was that when a company or when leaders would bring people into mediation, typically the women that came into mediation, their conflict had gone on much longer. There was much more avoidance going on. The conflict had become protracted. It had sort of swept other people up in its, in its movement. And when I was seeing a lot of clients that were male, the conflict was earlier on. It hadn't sort of lost context. And one of the things that I learned after talking with many of these clients was that often a struggle for women in leadership is because the relationship is so important and of high value. There is that fear sometimes to address conflict because of the fear of hurting feelings or damaging relationship. And what I know to be true is that when we avoid those conflicts, the trust does erode, the relationship is damaged, and all of what you don't want to see happen actually is the result. So that was interesting for me to observe that over many years, that I think sometimes there are differences, again, it's a generalization, but differences in how we manage those really difficult emotional or relationship challenges that we come up against and bump up against in the workplace as leaders.
There was I'm sorry, Kathy.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, there was a woman that I was coaching a number of years ago, and her male boss had brought me in to coach her. And one of his complaints was her team is just always in turmoil, and she just doesn't seem to know what to do about it. And so as we were working together, she made a comment to me that she had one disruptor on the team that was causing a lot of problems. And she goes, well, I just don't want to hurt their feelings. And I just feel bad about shutting them down because they do have good ideas. And she had all these excuses for why she didn't deal with this disruptor, head on. And I said, but you are penalizing the rest of the team. And then she was like, well, now what do I do? Because I have to worry about all of them. I have to worry about all those people. And I said, but you need to treat people as individuals, and you need to treat the team as a whole. And when you have one person who is causing so much turmoil on a team, now you have to think about the health of the team and not that one individual. and so through that, we were able to work out some ways that she could value the heart and the soul of the team itself, and be able to deal with this individual separately and save the team.
One of you just reminded me of something, Patty. I sort of had this big light bulb go off. One of the things I think that happens for us in a leadership role is that we think we have to be all things to all people at all times, have every answer and every solution. Yeah. Otherwise, we're going to be perceived as incapable or not skilled. Yeah. And what I've learned is that, boy, that's so not true. And when we can, because it's impossible to be that. Mm-hmm. And employees generally don't expect that of us. And when we can show as leaders a little bit of appropriate vulnerability, where it's okay to say, I don't have an answer for that, but you know what, let me go find out, or I don't know what to do about this. What does this amazing team that I work with have to say about that? Yeah. And I had a leader who was in one of those positions where she did not know what to do, and she was very emotional with me. And she took a step into vulnerability in the team charter process I was facilitating. And she said to the team, I don't know what to do. I feel like I should have the answers. I feel like I should have the solutions. For Pete's sakes, I'm the leader here. And one of the long-term staff, who was sort of the disruptor in the group, who was struggling with everyone, she got up and she asked her supervisor, could I give you a hug? And she said, in the 20 years I've worked here, those 3 sentences were the most powerful learning I've ever received, because you just said, I don't have to be perfect. Yes. And I thought, wow. And so her eyes just kind of went, I've never expected you to be perfect. And what the staff said is, but when you've never allowed us to, or invited us to help you, we feel like that's the need. And that team transformed in that moment. What I saw happen was so powerful. And for me, as a leader and as a woman, it reminded me that that level of vulnerability can help change people's lives and how they work together. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. And so part of that, one of the things that I hear a lot from people is that they're feeling excluded from things, and some of this is that you're not invited to the meetings, or someone's supposed to contact you, and it's been a week and they haven't contacted me, and so how do you deal with exclusions? Now, one of the best advice I got from a mentor was, Kathy, you're only going to be excluded if you feel you're excluded. And so that's one thing. And second is, in going along with the terms of exclusion, is that if you're in a meeting and you are the go-to person for this topic, but they'll go right past you, and then they'll ask someone else in the meeting, and excuse me, I'm here. How do you handle those situations of exclusion, both from physical exclusion from meetings, or exclusion when the topics are not being addressed to you?
Part of it, I think, is developing that confidence to ask good questions, because I've seen that in meetings that I've been a part of and that I've facilitated. And one of the things is we often draw assumptions about what someone's intentions mean, and often they may have simply just forgot. And so one of the things I've learned is, rather than assume, which we often do, we default to an assumption, is say, oh, I noticed that there was a meeting going on next Thursday, and I hadn't received a call yet. It's probably an oversight, or maybe I'm not needed at that meeting, but I just wanted to check to see if I needed to slot that time off on my calendar. And often the other person on the end of the phone will say, oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot to call you. Can you come? Or you're right, the meeting is actually a smaller group of people, and here's why. But it allows that conversation. That's one piece. When it happens in the room, what's really interesting is when it happens in the room and it doesn't get addressed, usually what happens is there is what I call the meeting after the meeting. So that's when the people have the meeting, and then they get really ticked off and they go to their private offices and complain about the meeting, which is so damaging for the team. And then the leader has to fix more stuff. So one of the things that we can do as leaders is that if we know somebody would typically comment on this particular issue, like you said, Kathy, you're the go-to person for that, it's totally okay for the leader to say something like, there's a few of you we haven't heard from yet. Kathy, I've heard you comment on these types of things in past before. I'd welcome your input. And then maybe, Sue, could we hear from you, and you as well, Patty? And that's a way of making sure that you're creating an inclusive culture, but also getting that input, and you've invited anyone else to comment.
Yeah, a good meeting facilitator, or if it happens to be the leader who's leading the meeting, will recognize that this stuff is going on. But if it happens to be going on and nobody is giving you space, and you are the expert, or you do have something of value to input there, and nobody is giving you that space to do it, then I'm a huge proponent, especially with women and women in technology, where sometimes this just happens, they get pushed to the side, is just saying, I have something to add. Yes. Not, can I say something? No, don't say, can I say something? It's, I have something to add. And you have to make that
writer downer, everyone. I have something to add.
You have to make that space for yourself. If they're not giving it to you, you make it yourself.
That's great.
I love
well,
that you gave people the words, Patty, because I think sometimes what happens is we don't know how to frame that request, so it comes out weird. It comes out sounding defensive or accusatory. So when you can create a few things like, I have something to add, which is not asking for permission, or I'd love to make a comment here, whatever is natural in your language, write that down, 2 or 3 statements, practice it in front of the mirror so it becomes part of your language. Because I love what you've said, Patty, because then you're coming out with your contribution in a really confident way.
Yeah.
Those are great tips. We have one other topic before we go into the Q&A. So please, people on the line, please ask your questions. And the last topic that we like to talk about is resiliency. And I think women are resilient because some of the obstacles they may face. So maybe we could talk about what are some of those obstacles, and let's talk about the overall topic of resiliency.
Yeah.
My favorite thing to talk about.
Yes, me too. The ability to bounce forward, not back.
Exactly. Yeah. Resilience is one of my core values. It's mentioned in my mission statement and so forth. And my personal journey through it, I guess, is it's personal, and it's very dear to my heart, because it was something I sort of learned and then have used throughout my personal life and my career. And that was, I talk about this in my book, was the end of a long-term marriage that ended very suddenly. And I was literally overnight, left with being a single mom and losing my home and having my income cut by 2/3 and all of these crazy things that were like, now what do I do? Where do I go from here? And learning that I didn't die through that, learning that I found out things about myself and about my kids and about my family and about the way the community interacts with you when your identity has completely been ripped apart and so forth, really has served me well in the ensuing 20-something years, since that time. And it really struck me about 5 years ago. I had left a company to go work with a small startup, and literally the job of my dreams, the CEO of my dreams, the everything of my dreams. And I pretty much left a solid, safe place to go and do this thing. And in 6 months, the whole thing was belly up. I had hired more than 45 people and then got to lay them all off in less than 6 months. It was the most devastating professional thing that had ever happened to me. And I was sitting in a coffee shop, and it suddenly struck me the similarity between that situation and when my marriage had broken up. I was sitting there feeling sorry for myself. I was feeling like, this isn't fair. This is not what I was promised, blah, 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 blah. And I sat there and thought, wow, this is the same thing, but in a professional stance. And it was, all right, what are you going to do now? You're going to pick yourself up. You're going to dust yourself off. You're going to go see how you can be of service to somebody else and get yourself out of this and take yourself to the next level, because things don't, I believe our perspective has everything to do with whether we are victimized or whether we find the door out, the path out. So it was developing resilience, looking for opportunities to develop your resilience is, I think, one of the most valuable things, especially as women leaders, that we can develop.
Yeah, I
It
couldn't
sounds like
agree
you're
with
even
you.
stronger than before. Yeah, Charmaine.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Patty. And your story, you know, is so helpful in understanding resilience and why it's so important, because in life, tough stuff happens. Tough stuff happens at work, to all of us, and our stories are different. You know, I learned about resilience after surviving a near-death sailboat accident with my then boyfriend, who basically saved our lives by proposing to me as we were drowning. Poor guy never thought he was going to make it. So he married me a year later. But my point here in this story is, while we were swimming for our life, I noticed something very important. When my thoughts were about, oh my gosh, we're not going to make it. When did I call my mom and dad last? Who's going to feed the dog tonight? This is awful. And I would go into victim mode. When all of these negative thoughts would go through my head, I literally lost the ability to swim.
Yes.
My physical strength was gone. When I filled my head with, I can do this. I've got a wedding to plan, man. I need to get back to shore. You know, I have lots to do in my lifetime. When I would think from that frame of reference, my physical ability to swim was noticeably different. And so that moment in the lake was when I decided I'm changing the definition of resilience, which is normally the ability to bounce back after, you know, challenge. And I decided that day that I'm going to say resilience is about bouncing forward after change, conflict, adversity, and crisis. And it's those steps that you take. You describe, you know, those steps that you take, mini steps, tiny steps, about learning, stepping into action, making a decision instead of being in limbo. Any little steps you take are what help you be resilient. And resilience is kind of like a muscle. You've got to work it daily, just like you do with our own bodies. We've got to work those muscles at the gym to become stronger and healthy. Our resilience is like that too. So every little step that you take to nurture yourself, care for yourself, and build your resilience will pay off immensely, but it's got to be something we intentionally do. It's not something you do just in a stressful moment and then forget about it for 10 years.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Those are
people make resilient teams. And I think if we tie it back to what Kathy started with the first part of our conversation, you know, resilient people do make resilient teams. And those are the people that are going to be able to handle change and deal with conflict effectively and deal with uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like you said, deal with the focus that you need you to have and looking for the results that the teams need to have. So that really does help and add something to teams.
Yes.
Well, thank you both. Those are great discussions. We do have a lot of questions coming up. And so if you don't mind, I'll take a couple of the top questions here from our listeners. And thank you all for the listeners on your questions. You can still post more questions. And also you can upvote if you see a question there that really resonates with you. Yeah. So the first question from our audience here is from Sonia, and it's, if leaders are themselves uncomfortable with a change or disagree with a change, how can they find a balance between helping their team navigate and manage the change conflict while still being approachable and appropriately vulnerable? And is it ever appropriate for a leader to admit that they are frustrated as well, or is that counterproductive?
Good question.
So I think it's completely appropriate for them to admit that they are frustrated or they don't understand the change, because that makes them now approachable by the team. However, they are in a leadership role and they need to not get down in the mud, I guess, you know, more or less, and start bashing management and talking about how stupid it is and all of that. They're kind of walking a tightrope there where they need to support the initiative, support their management, step into that leadership role while still admitting this is difficult for me as well. I understand where you're coming from because I have some of the same questions. Now, how can we resolve this, or how can we make this better, or what are the things that we can do to be more solutions focused instead of just rehashing all of the things that we're concerned about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you've said something critically important is that very fine line between when we acknowledge someone's pain or frustration versus when we actually are appearing that we're contributing to gossip. And then that's a very dangerous path for leaders. So I often suggest that it's helpful to say things such as, I can understand that this is frustrating for you. When change brings about uncertainty and a whole bunch of questions that there aren't answers yet for, I totally get that frustration. I feel that too. So you're not at all mentioning the company, upper management, the actual policy. It's the impact that you're talking about. And it's coming from an I message. And then I love what you said, Patty, bring people together for solutions. Or the other thing you can do is say, what kind of questions does this bring up for you? Because sometimes if we have answers to our questions, our fear and frustration goes down. And we know that to be true. When knowledge goes up, my friend Dr. Sean DePerrin always says, when knowledge goes up, fear goes down. And so that's one of the things we can do is invite people to give us questions.
And that's great. And one thing that you might also do is, as a leader, you have your own people that you go to for mentorship. And like I said at the beginning of the discussions, they could be in other verticals. So I have some friends and mentors in biotech, and we discreetly talk about, how we can best manage and lead sometimes. So having your own, someone says to even have your own board of directors so that you can help lead by consulting and working with other teams.
Yeah, that's brilliant. We all need that support. And I heard the other day somebody said, I have my own board of directors right up here. I love what you're talking about, Kathy. Not that board of directors, the board of directors that it's your trusted allies, because we all need that as leader, and our staff are not the right people to be those trusted allies. And so I think you've raised something super important there, Kathy.
That's an excellent point. And there's something that goes into the idea of change fatigue, and so if we do this right, as you're going into a change time of change or a change initiative, and we work with those middle managers, and I think I mentioned this earlier, remind them they need to take care of themselves, because they are going to be a sounding board for all kinds of people. All kinds of stuff is going to come their way, and they need to recognize that they will get fatigued, that they will get sad, they'll get emotional. They need somebody, a sounding board to go to. They need to maintain their health. They need to do whatever they can to keep themselves buoyed up.
Yeah, very good. All right, we have another question from the audience. This one's from Godiva Golding. We've been going through a lot of changes in our small startup. Being disrespectful and throwing people under the bus has become the norm for one team member in particular. But the CEO has allowed this to be here to continue. How do we navigate a situation like this where a disruptor isolates you from your team by making you appear incompetent? Good question.
It's a great question. I actually had my very first leader job. You're taking me back to a painful place. No.
Remember resiliency.
My very first leadership role. That's what happened right in front of the staff, 14 staff, and somebody threw me under the bus and was very cutting and comparing me to the former leader and making very sideways comments that felt like verbal jabs to me. And inside, I was, wanting to cry, wanting to lash out, wanting to push back. And so I remember my training in conflict. So I thought, just ask a question. So when this person was saying, everyone feels this way, you're the only one that's not noticing this, Charmaine. We all feel this way. I simply said, wow, tell me more. Who is everyone? I mean, everyone was her. But she was using that generalization to sort of build this bigger credential about her issue. But what I did, because it happened in the moment, I was really toying with, do I address this here or do I address this later? My fear was if I just address this later, the team thinks, wow, she can't handle that. Wow, she let somebody sort of verbally beat her up. And so I said I provided very respectful feedback to the individual in the meeting by pointing out that I felt that there was some frustration happening and I would really love to explore what's behind the comments.
Yeah.
And then I met with the person individually immediately after the staff meeting and provided some constructive feedback and some mentoring around why that type of approach for anyone, not just directed at me, for any colleague, is not okay. And we actually role played. I said, what would this be like for you in the meeting?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I went into that role, she said, she just felt horrible. She wasn't realizing the impact that her words were having on people. So I think feedback, questions, addressing it, do not let it linger, and finding out what's going on, because often there's something behind it. It's sort of like what I call the iceberg. It's a common methodology. Patty knows all about this in conflict, that we have to get below the surface of that iceberg to understand what is really going on and what is driving this person's position or comments.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So
they might need coaching or mentoring to not show up like that anymore.
Yes. So I had two experiences. One very much like what you're talking about, Charmaine, where I had stepped into a role of leadership, been hired from the outside, stepped into this role, had, like 18 direct reports in this particular team. And one of the members of the team was just incredibly disrespectful, constantly. And it wasn't one-on-one. It was always in a public setting or in a meeting where it was just overt. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. I couldn't figure out why I was having such a hard time connecting with this person. I didn't seem to be having it with everybody else, but with this person, it was just so incredibly negative. And I talked to her about it. She denied it. In the meeting, I would address it and she would laugh it off or something, and everybody else would laugh. And so I finally talked to a few peers. We talked about that sounding board, a few people that were at my level, only to find out that she had applied for the job I had been hired for. And I got it and she didn't. And she had been there for a very, very long time. So there was this whole simmering thing going on under there that I knew nothing about. It had nothing to do with me. And I was able to, once I had that information, then I was able to go to her one-on-one. We were able to have a very different conversation and kind of smooth things over. And plus I helped her see what she was doing was not good for the team, was undermining, and we weren't going to get anywhere and all of that. The other situation that I think might kind of go to what the question was I was working in a company where a new leader had been brought in. So he was above me. I didn't report directly to him, but I reported to someone who reported to him. And this person was just the biggest bully I'd ever seen in the workplace. And because of his title, he felt immune, and the CEO would not deal with it. Nobody would deal with it. He was literally just wreaking havoc everywhere in my individual personal life, in my team's life, in just, ripples all around. And so I had a very strategic conversation with our VP of HR. And I mentioned to him, I used very important words like hostile work environment, abuse and harassment. And wow, it was amazing when you started throwing about legal terms like that, where people didn't want to deal with the bully. When you started talking about it from a legal standpoint, and I'm saying when nothing else had worked. Right. Then there was suddenly some coaching that was going on with that person. And in a startup, they often don't have policies and procedures, and they don't have, they don't have established norms that say this is the way this company works. But every startup doesn't want to be, one step away from a lawsuit and losing the company. So exactly. I'm not saying that's the best approach, but I'm saying that might be a when all else has failed kind of approach.
And if the company's small and doesn't have an HR shop, it's very valuable to go to that CEO. And this might be a perfect example of the difficult conversation. I'm air quoting it, but where we have to use that courageous dialogue. But for the CEO to understand the impact, that CEO, honestly, I've seen so many times, they don't recognize, and I'm not saying CEOs in general, I'm not labeling them, but sometimes as people, we just don't understand the impact of our involvement or lack of involvement that it has on other people. So this could be a great opportunity for courageous dialogue and feedback to the CEO about what you are experiencing and observing, and the impact of that CEO allowing it to happen, of what the impact is on you and the other person. That CEO may say, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Oh, I am so sorry. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. And goes around quickly to fix it. Or you might have a CEO that doesn't respond that way, and then that becomes a different conversation. But I think I love the ability to have those conversations, even though they're tough and take courage, because people can't change what they don't know. Yeah. So if the CEO doesn't know that he or she is doing that, or it's having an impact on you, it's really tough for them to change their behavior.
I think those are great, and I think we could even do a whole hour discussion on handling bullies in just in general, especially when they are the most technically talented. Sometimes it's harder to get through if they're providing the technical content and then they've got a personality. And one of the things that I also heard you mention was that when you're communicating, make sure you change up the way that your communication to find that tip of the iceberg. I had some people that would just go email. It's like, stop with the emails, give them a call, have lunch with them. Go figure out different methods of communications as you're finding out what that iceberg really is. So those are really good. I think we have time for one more question, but we'll need quick answers to these. And I think the next two are actually related. And they're related in the sense that, one from Ophelia, what can you do when your leadership tells you to be more confident, but they keep undermining your decisions? And related to that, in the midst of consistently being undermined, I find that I'm being withdrawn on my team, which makes me appear to be selling myself short. How can you deal with those situations? So if we can get some brief answers to those.
Patty, go for it. You got your, I can see that you want to tackle this one. Go for it.
I was just thinking, how do you put this into a short, succinct, succinct thing? Okay, this is going to be a little bit of controversial advice, because I am sensing in her question that there may be a male-female kind of thing going on here, where he says you should be more confident and then undermines her. I had a colleague at another company that I used him so much for, tell me, how am I showing up? Tell me, how do I look? Tell me, how am I being perceived? We were peers, so there was no leadership relationship there. We were just peers, but I trusted his input, and we became trusted advisors, for one another. And he pointed out to me times that I withdrew, that I'm not a super competitive person, and I would just not compete. If I was being sidelined, if I was being, ignored or whatever, I would just kind of sit back and let it happen, because I just wasn't going to compete with you. And then the organization was losing my contribution. They were losing my experience. They were losing all of those different things. But he was the one who could help me understand that. So when I say it's controversial, sometimes we think, well, I don't want to go ask a man what to do. Well, they're the best one to ask in this situation, because they have a different perspective than you do about how you're showing up.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Patty and Charmaine. This has been an amazing discussion. Thank you for everybody. I do want to remind everybody that the 6th annual IEEE Women in Engineering International Leader Conference is quickly approaching, and that we do hope you'll join us in Austin, Texas on May 23rd and 24th at the JW Marriott Hotel in Austin, Texas. More information can be found on our website at IEEE-WIE-ILC.org. And especially everyone, I want you to tune in next week. We'll have our second virtual track section on April 25th with Fang Li from IBM. Fang will discuss her work in developing over 150 patents and how she can inspire you to become an invention addict just like her. It should be an amazing event. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to our amazing panelists, and thank you for everyone that attended today. And I want everyone to have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.